After the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness, now comes the third leg of the Triple Crown, the Belmont. An update from PETA's Equine Matters Department, dedicated on stopping the cruelty of horse racing. Next on the PETA Podcast with Emil, Guillermo. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights, brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. As a young man, I used to love the horse races, but I lost my taste for it once I saw a horse get up from a fall and tried to finish the race with its broken leg dangling. The horse was euthanized, and that was it for me. Horse racing is cruel and can be fatal. The fatality rate in horse racing these days in the U.S. is about 3 horses a day. Even on the championship days, like the Triple Crown races and this week's Belmont Stakes. PETA Sr.VP Guillermo, whose duties include heading up the Equine Matters Department, talked to me about the prevailing narrative this year, where racing is just trying to make sure no horses get hurt and die during its most visible time of year. The Belmont Stakes, the Triple Crown, this is really the most important time for racing, right?
It certainly is the time when the racing industry hopes that people are watching and that they might even gain some new fans. It's the biggest part of racing in the entire year.
So this year, the Triple Crown, is it special or is it just pretty ordinary? Because it doesn't seem like we have a potential Triple Crown winner, do we?
No, I think in terms of the horses and the name recognition for the public, it's a very ordinary kind of year. But I would like to point out that we're coming off a year last year in which there were many deaths. And the story that surrounded the Triple Crown races, the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness Stakes, and the Belmont Stakes in 2023 were all about how many horses were dying. 12 horses died at Churchill Downs in the week before, during, and after the Kentucky Derby. A horse died of the Preakness, one of Bob Baffert's horses trained by him, and 2 horses died on Belmont weekend. And then the Saratoga Springs season that followed the Belmont Stakes, 14 horses died during that season. And this year, the Belmont Stakes will be held at the Saratoga track. So the story, the narrative about who's going to live and who's going to die has been, frankly, more important than the names of famous horses.
So how does this year compare with last? Last year, you had 12 horses died at Churchill Downs, as you said. 2 horses died Belmont weekend. 14 horses died during the Saratoga summer season. That's a lot of dead horses. What's it looking like this year?
You know, it really caught the racing industry off guard last year that the story was so enormous. And people will probably remember, if they think about last year's Kentucky Derby, that there was one death after another death after another death. Some changes were made. Some safety precautions were put in to protect the horses. There were no deaths at Churchill Downs this year, which is a good thing. And as you remember, we discussed last year, Churchill Downs actually suspended racing after we recommended that and moved it to another track because of the deaths. So there have been some improvements. There were no deaths at the Preakness, but one horse trained by Dwayne Lucas, who had the horse who won the Preakness Stakes, another one of his horses in that same race, did suffer a fracture, didn't die, fortunately, underwent surgery. And that was a case of a horse who came in 17 lengths behind the winner of the Kentucky Derby and never should have been put in that race. And it remains to be seen what will happen to the Belmont Stakes. But I do want to point out that when we look at the number of horses who died in New York State this year compared to last year, and I'm not talking about the Triple Crown races, but at all of the 11 tracks in New York State, the harness racing and the thoroughbred tracks, their number of deaths in racing and training are up 50% over this time last year. So I am not hopeful about New York State.
Let's go back to the beginning in terms of horse racing deaths. How does a horse die in a horse race? I mean, Aren't these things supposed to be pretty controlled? We don't expect horses to die in horse races, do we?
We do now. The ironic thing is that all along, horses have died on racetracks in the US. And that number, as far as we know, is still around 3 horses a day, every single day, who are killed on tracks, mostly because they have broken bones. And when I say they have always died, I think what happened in the past was that nobody was paying any attention. Now more than ever, people are not paying attention to horse racing, but what they are paying attention to is the deaths. And so what will typically happen, and we know this from research that's been done, is that 90% of those horses who break a bone on a track and then are euthanized, because it's usually very difficult to try to fix that bone and have the horse survive, 90% of those horses have a pre-existing injury right at the site on their bones where that break occurs. So if the people in racing were responsible and were very cautious about overworking their horses and not drugging their horses so that the medication then masks the pain they may feel, they could eliminate many of those deaths. Horse racing is never going to be entirely safe. That's the reason PETA will never support horse racing. But they could do so much better than they are now. And we've seen some states try to do this. We've seen the passage of the federal legislation to provide oversight on medication and other issues involving horse racing. But we are still seeing horses die, and that's unacceptable.
But the fact is, before PETA started paying attention to this and shined a light on the fact that it was happening frequently, not just in New York recently, but a few years back in Los Angeles, people began to see that we had an industry that was racing infirm horses or horses who shouldn't be racing. I mean, that really is the reason why horses are dying, right? Because horses who shouldn't be racing are sent to the racetrack to race. And that is wrong.
In nearly every case, that is what happens. And there are ways to mitigate against that. And you're right. We began working on this issue in 2008. And up until that time, people were not really paying attention. It's America 2024. We don't like circuses. We don't like entertainment that exploits and harms animals. We don't like SeaWorld. And we don't like horses dying on racetracks. And that's the reality that racing has to grapple with.
And so this year, it's been better than last year, and from the Triple Crown from Churchill Downs and the Kentucky Derby to the Belmont in New York. What have they done differently?
I'm sorry to say, I think trainers and owners will always send infirm horses to race because they're not making money if they're not racing. And so it really comes down to what the tracks are going to do and what the law enforcement or the regulatory body for horse racing is going to do. And one of the things that they have done in some places, and certainly they have made more of an effort at Churchill Downs, is to examine the records of these horses. There are things that should trigger serious red flags when you look at horses who have a record of racing in the previous year or 2 years. And of course, for these young horses that are only 3, there's only a year to look back. But they need to see, how often was this horse raced? How often was this horse subjected to a timed workout? Were there injuries? What were the medication records given? All of this is an indication of whether or not the horse was sore or injured in some way. And by looking at that, they can tell a lot. In nearly every case where we take a look at a horse who's had an injury, we can see some sort of pattern in this way. For example, the horse who died last year in the Preakness Stakes was a horse trained by Bob Baffert. And he was not the winning horse in that race, even though Bob Baffert did have the horse who won the Preakness Stakes. But when the necropsy was done on that horse and an investigation was done, and this was released in a documentary put out by the New York Times recently that people can find on Hulu, they looked at the necropsy report of that horse. That horse had pathology in all 4 legs. And by pathology, I mean that horse was injured in all 4 legs. And not only was the horse injured, but the horse had worms. The horse had parasites. So even the most basic veterinary care was not being provided by one of the richest, most famous trainers in America. And that's the kind of thing that can be observed when the track officials are looking at the records and they're looking at what the horse has done over the last 6 to 12 months.
It's astonishing, though, that horse was able or deemed fit to run and ran and died.
That's exactly right. And it's so distancing to talk about statistics and causes and records, but we have to think and remember that every single one of these horses is an individual. This is a horse who's as interested in his own life as we are in ours. And this is what happened to the horse at the age of 3. This horse was put on a track, broke a bone, and was euthanized. This horse was killed on a racetrack. And we have to think of it that way because that is the reality of it. And I just, when we look at this year's Preakness Stakes and we see the horse that D. Wayne Lucas ran, who finished so far back in the Kentucky Derby, Just Steel is the horse's name. And we think, why on earth would Lucas put this horse in the Preakness Stakes when he clearly was not competitive in the Kentucky Derby? And that should be a red flag for that track as well. You look at a horse who finishes so far back in a race, and you have to say, was he sore? Is that why it happened? And pull him out of that race. And he might not have fractured an ankle.
But whether or not a horse runs or not in a given race, it's really the prerogative of the trainer and the owner. And they're not thinking about the horses.
They would claim that they're thinking about the horses. They will tell you how much they love their horses. They love their horses so much that they medicate them so that they can't feel the injury and then put them out on the track. No, it really comes down to the track officials and to the Horse Racing Integrity and Safety Authority to set these standards. And every single horse needs to be looked at in this way. All of these records need to be observed. And that's the bare minimum that they could do on these tracks.
It's hard to believe that there aren't uniform standards at all the tracks where horses are run and where people bet real money thinking that they could win if a horse wins. But if a horse really is injured and has no chance, the game is really a cheat. And not only is it harmful to the bettors, but it's even more harmful to the horse who has no business on the track.
I think that's why people have turned away from racing in the droves. I mean, if we look at the statistics of horse racing, the number of thoroughbred foals born now or in 2023 compared to 20 years ago, half the number of thoroughbred foals are born. The total betting handle, the total amount of money bet on horse racing has been stagnant for 20 years. This is not a sport that is growing by any means, and it is shrinking. And it will continue to shrink unless the part of the horse racing world that doesn't want to face up to this fact faces up to it and deals with it.
And so how do you explain the fact that the networks go crazy about getting rights to the Triple Crown, the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, the Belmont? They go crazy about getting the rights to the Breeders' Cup, and which is the races that happen at the end of the year, and then they award Horse of the Year. I mean, they're really trying to keep a sport alive that really maybe it's time for the sport to end.
The networks that run these races, if you look at what they show, it's, for example, the Kentucky Derby, they have a 2 to 3 hour program on the network. All of the other races for that whole weekend are run on smaller channels. So it's very little if you think about it. While you can find a horse racing channel and watch racing basically any day of the year, when it comes down to what is seen on network TV, what do we have, 12 hours maybe in the entire year? That's about it.
Yeah, it's almost as if it's an advertisement for the racing industry, in the same way that journalism, sports journalism, at times when it's not very good sports journalism, when they don't dig deeper into things like horse racing deaths or, the drugging of horses, and they just cover, the who wins and what the payouts were. It really is just like a PR wing for the racing industry. And now it's almost forced people who consider themselves to be racing journalists or practicing journalists in the sport of horse racing. It's forced them to be real journalists, which I guess some have, but some have resisted because they are in service to the industry.
Well, look at what the networks want out of showing the Kentucky Derby. They want ratings. They want people to be looking at the race. And most of the people who watch the Kentucky Derby or the Preakness Stakes or the Belmont Stakes don't follow horse racing with any regularity. It's an excuse to have a party. It's an excuse to make a fancy cocktail, invite your friends over. For a couple of minutes, you're cheering for the horse you chose because you like his color or you like the name. And that's really all it amounts to. And, I think, frankly, if you look at the history of horse racing in America, you can see where things started to go wrong. It used to be that racing was something that happened just a few weeks a year, and it was a local activity. And the horses would race, they would race, for example, in the summertime or in the springtime, and then they would go back to the farm and they would live in the pasture until the next year. They would have many months of rest and time off to be a horse, to be around other horses in the way that they need to be able to move their legs in the way that physiologically they need to do, not just racing, but walking around a pasture, grazing, the kinds of things that make a horse feel like a horse. Then it began to be a moneymaker, and the number of tracks grew, and the number of bettors grew, and then the number of horses born grew. And suddenly we had racing all year round, and horses were going from track to track in many cases. And that's been to the detriment of the animals, and ultimately, of course, now to the detriment of horse racing.
And so you mentioned when you talk about horse racing, you talk about how entertainment and animals, it changed with the circus. It changed with how people view things like SeaWorld and the orcas. I suppose it's happening now in terms of an animal rights perspective on the horses in horse racing.
Oh, there's no question. The public's attitude toward the use of animals for entertainment has changed drastically in the last few decades. I've been with PETA for 35 years now. So I was involved in those very first protests we did at circuses, the very first protests we did at the SeaWorld and similar aquarium locations, where we were an oddity as people filed in their cars to look at the elephants perform or the tigers jump through hoops. That is just no longer the case. We have an evolving public mind that's just not willing to accept that animals are going to be abused and imprisoned and tormented and forced to do something they don't really want to do. That's what I think the racing industry has been trying to grapple with over the last 10 years, perhaps even a little bit longer than that. And they really have to come to some sort of agreement about it in order to protect the horses as much as they possibly can. I think eventually horse racing is going to go because that's just the way the public has responded over the last decade. And I don't see that changing. But we need to do everything we can to prevent horses from dying as long as racing is going on.
So we had the breakdowns of the horses and the deaths last year. It's better this year. What do you think is going to happen on Belmont Day on Saturday?
It's always hard to say. I am hopeful that they're going to be as cautious as possible, that they have looked at the records of these animals, that they know what they're dealing with, that everybody gets a very thorough examination. They certainly haven't done what we have wanted them to do in order to protect the horses. But really, who knows? When we're looking at the number of horses who've died in New York this year compared to last, up 50%, as I said, it doesn't bode well for New York State. And anybody who is watching this race on TV or who's placing a bet or who thinks they're going to go out to Belmont Park and watch it, just be careful because you don't know what you're going to see out there. You don't know what you're going to see on TV. And I would urge people that until these deaths stop, just stay away from racing. Last year at Saratoga Springs, which is in upstate New York, which is where the Belmont Stakes will be held this year, they had those 14 deaths last year. One of them was a horse called New York Thunder, and he was expected to win. He was out in front of all the other horses. And as he got very close to the finish line, in front of this roaring grandstand full of people, his leg snapped. And it was the most horrific thing because he tried to get back up and keep running. It was heartbreaking. And people got up and walked out of Saratoga Racecourse that day because that's not what you come to see racing for. And yet, you're likely going to see that if you go to any track in America on any given day.
And that's the thing about horse racing, because the athletes, we'll give some credit to the jockeys, but the real athletes are the horses. And if anyone died in a major spectator sport in America, football, baseball, hockey, basketball, people would be aghast. They'd want rules. They'd want to make sure it never happened again.
What's the fatality rate of baseball? I mean, it's crazy that there's a sport that people put money down on that has something called a fatality rate that is tallied every year by the Jockey Club.
What's the fatality rate in racing?
Well, it depends on what the track surface is. It depends on what the track is. But as we know right now, it's about 3 to 4 horses every single day.
The Belmont Stakes ends the Triple Crown. The racing doesn't go away. They'll continue racing in the summertime in various places around the country. But there are some races that are more, I guess you would say, legitimate than others. And some are major tracks, summer tracks like Saratoga, and some are bush tracks. And PETA worked alongside the Washington Post and revealed something about these bush tracks that happen all throughout the country, most notably in the Southeast, but they occur in places like in the Southwest also. What's an update on the bush track situation?
Yeah, the so-called bush tracks refer to what some people call unsanctioned racing, meaning it's not legal to be racing these animals, or it's outside of the realm of enforcement by the state racing commissions in those states that have those commissions. And what we see in these tracks is these are quarter horses, and they will be run 2 at a time. It's like a match race. It's about some varying lengths, but about a quarter of a mile race. But what we see at these tracks, since there's nobody paying attention and there's no thought that they need to abide by any kind of law, is that the horses are openly shot up with street drugs like cocaine, like methamphetamine, like Ritalin. And it's done as we filmed, or as our investigators filmed. You can see the syringes pulled out and injected right into the horse's neck. The jockey then gets on the horse. He's got 2 electroshock devices, one on each wrist, and a whip, and he's shocking and whipping the horses all the way down for the length of the track. It is the most appalling and most inhumane use of horses that I think I've ever seen, aside from possibly a bullfight where the horses come out first. And we exposed this. We met with officials with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and there was, based on our investigation, a raid planned by the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, Homeland Security, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Their plan was, based on information we had supplied, to raid a track in Georgia, to seize the cash and seize the drugs because there's illegal betting, in addition to the use of illegal drugs on these horses. And as the Washington Post reported earlier this year, for some reason, there was no raid. The investigation on the part of federal officials was called off. And so this obvious form of animal abuse, illegal gambling, illegal drugging, illegal sales of alcohol, they just turned their backs on it. What I can tell you is that we now have members of Congress who are very upset by that. And they're members of Congress from states where racing is sanctioned, where the kind of racing that we've just been talking about is illegal. And they are actually worried about what this bush track racing will do to legal racing. And so they have sent a letter to the Attorney General, Merrick Garland, and asked him to reopen the investigation.
Well, what's really crazy is that when we talk about places that are legal and sanctioned, we've talked about unregulated situations where infirm horses can be run and then break down and die, which it sounds like, well, there's not enough regulation there, there's not enough oversight. But now you've just been describing these bush tracks, the so-called bush tracks, which aren't exactly the minor leagues, but it's sort of this underworld of racing that exists in places like the Southeast. It's in the Southwest. They pop up. They drug the horses. They with street drugs, like you say, and then people bet on the side right then and there. There's like gambling and alcohol. Why do you suppose a raid, which was planned, was called off? That's what you're talking about. Why were the FBI and the DEA, Homeland Security, because I guess there are some people who are not in the country legally, but why were the raids called off?
I will never understand this to my dying day. Why, when we had the syringes that we picked up off the ground that had been discarded after horses were injected, we had them tested at the UC Davis lab where they do the drug testing for sanctioned racing in California. So we knew what was in them. There was a chain of custody for the evidence. It was so clear and obvious a case for them that it is a mystery to me what happened. And I can only guess that there was something political at some level somewhere. I think they have been shamed now by the Washington Post article because there are more than 100 of these tracks around the country. There's heavy involvement from Mexican drug cartels. There's suspicion that money is laundered through this racing. The drug money is laundered through this racing. And that this is going on in California. There are at least 8 tracks. In Texas, there are more than a dozen of these tracks. That this is going on in something like 30 states around the country, and nobody is doing anything, is a great shame on our law enforcement division in America.
And once again, this is something that's in the purview of PETA's Equine Matters Department. And this is something that was a kind of a surprise to have this underworld exist. I mean, it was bad enough that the legal sanctioned racing was bad, but this goes to show you just what is out there, and no one's paying attention except PETA.
Yeah, it doesn't say much for the FBI and for the Drug Enforcement Agency, for Homeland Security, for all of these departments that are supposed to be looking out for the animals, looking out for Americans. These places, I would think, would be quite dangerous in some cases. And they're going on basically down the road from a lot of communities in America.
You know, one last question. The Equine Matters Department that you had at PETA, how long has it been going on? And did you think that you would find as much to do in terms of fighting for the animals in horse racing?
There's so much more to be done. We started this in 2008 when a filly called 8 Bells died after she crossed the finish line in the Kentucky Derby. And I was, a horse person. I had horses when I was younger. Of course, I haven't ridden in many years and would not do so again. But I love horses. And I thought, well, a few simple fixes could make racing so much more humane. And I have to laugh at my naivety at the time. But what I have found over the years is how many people in racing actually do want to make change, but they're not the loud voices, and they need to be louder.
Kathy Guillermo of PETA's Equine Matters Department with an update on this week's Belmont Stakes, the third leg of the Triple Crown. For more information, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends. Tell them you like the PETA podcast. Contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter, or X, formerly known as Twitter, at Emil Amok, that's EMILAMOK, or see my vlog at amok.com. or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. And get this podcast on YouTube at Emil Amok 1. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by CarbonWorks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.